we're going to talk about is observation of behavior. This is one of the most commonly used methods of personality. This category of observation, there's uncontrolled and controlled structure, and it was those two are subdivided into two contrasting types against a non-participant and a detached participant. In the unstructured observation, it just refers to the watching or recording of what people do in real life situations. Then we have naturalistic observation methods, which is where we gather information as much as possible about the person without having to disturb like their natural settings or any behavior that they do. An advantage of an unstructured observation is that it focuses on the researcher's predetermined conceptual framework or their theoretical biases. We also talk about the reactive effect, which is also known as the guinea pig effect, which is when the presence of an observer in the room, it tends to alter their behavior of the participant because now they feel like they're being observed, and then that's a little bit problematic because it does change like the natural environment and the setting of it all. Then we have participation observation. This is for in order to combat against the guinea pig effect. This is a process in which the observer actively participates in the daily lives of the people under the study in order not to be a outsider anymore, and is usually accepted by the subject as one of their own. So the researcher put themselves inside the environment in order to not affect it, and becomes one of the environment. Um, these were the disadvantages of participant observations. There was the possibility of disturbing the natural setting, in which we talked about. The difficulties of being accepted by the subject, meaning that sometimes the subject just won't accept you as part of their environment and will like have a harder interaction between them. And then the vulnerability of losing objectivity in the observation due to close interaction with the subject, meaning that the researcher, ends up feeling for these people and in some way alters their like findings. We talked about structure observation, which refers to the observation of individuals and situations structured or controlled by the researcher. We also talked about how it was similar to structured observation to laboratory experiments that have extensively used by psychologists for testing job applications, evaluating work performances, or for accessing clinically related problems such as mother child or role play testing. We talk about structured observation, can also be participant or non participants. Some of the problems with these observations, however, are the structure of the laboratory situation that truly reflects the real life of the situation. We found the guinea pig effect and the ethical problems are more problematic in structured observation since the subjects are usually tested or evaluated by the situation that are controlled or even created by the researcher itself. So then we move on into interviewers and questionnaires. Interviewing is another common method of assessing personality across disciplines. Due to its limitation on complexity and the length of the interview and on this close personal interaction between the researcher and the subject, telephone interviewing has not considered as an adequate method of assessing personality yet. These are the four good reasons and why it's preferred. The first one is we have face-to-face interviewing, which is usually less structured and more flexible than the highly standardized questionnaire designed for self-administration or telephone survey. Our second one is the interview provides the interviewer on an opportunity to establish rapport with the subject before proceeding. And the third one is in situations for assessing health and mental health problems. The interviewer may be able to give careful personal attention to the disturbed or confused client in order to success and fully communicate the need of information. The fourth one is the interview provides a chance to observe the subject's reaction both to the obvious and subtle ones. All right. So then we talked about what is a standardized observation, or other ways known as a structured interview, which is usually conducted with a predetermined interview schedule, which is assigned to collect the same range of information from a number of respondents, depending on the nature of the researcher or interviewer schedule. It may be highly complex or very simple. We also talked about non-standardized or unstructured interviews, which is defined as without a definite interview schedule. Hence, each respondent may be asked different kinds of questions by the interviewer, meaning pretty much that they don't have a preferred way of letting you get these questions. Then we have the standardized interview. Why it's a better option is because it's cost effective. A worse option is because it's cost effective and it provides researchers with the aggregated data on the respondents, which could be statistically analyzed and compared. The disadvantage of standardized interview may be its limitation on the scope of researchers' inquiry and flexibility, and also the possibility of theoretical and methodological errors or biases inside the standardized interview schedule. A non-standardized interview is open, flexible, and even sometimes invites findings, pretty much saying accidental discovery or useful information. However, it is a costly information and can be statistically analyzed and compared. Uh, these are the potential facilities of communications talked about by Gordon. These were the eight, I believe, which was fulfilling expectations, recognition, austeric appeal, sympathetic understanding, a new experience, catharsis, and the need of meaning, and the extrinsic rewards. These are inhibitors of communication, pretty much what stops the flow of the interview and makes it a little bit worse. We have competing time demands, we have ego threat, we have etiquette, we have trauma, we have forgetting, we have chronological confusion, and we have inferential confusion and unconscious experience. Then we moved on to problems of reliability and validity in data collection. Reliability refers to the repeatability or dependability of the instrument to be measured by the user. Validity refers to the truthfulness of the measure that is the extent which an instrument measures what it's supposed to measure. This is supposed to say supposed, not unopposed. We then talked about reliability is necessary but not sufficient for validity. And then these are the three methods of assessing validity. The first one was content validity, which refers to the extent to which measures the adequately represents all significant components of a phenomenon in a question. And then we have content validity largely depends on the researcher and elaboration of the rationale and why certain components are selected and how these components are measured. Then we moved on to criterion related validity, which means the concern mainly to practical usefulness of an instrument designed to measure a specific trait or behavior, which is called criterion. The closer the correspondence between the measure and the criterion, the more useful or valid the criterion, the more useful or valid the measure for predicting the criterion. And this was divided into two sub um, subdivisions. The first one is concurrent validity, which refers to the ability of a measure to indicate an individual present standing on the criterion variable. An example was given on the book, which talked about a mental health inventory designed to identify those in a psychiatric care, could be given the sample of a well, and then being given a sample of a well person, and then they compare the person who is well with the person who needs mental care. And then we have a predictive validity, in which it measures the validity with a reference to the future standing on the criterion variable. An example given in the book was that it validates the comparing of an exam score of a high school student with a criterion measure of their success in college, such as grade point average or whatever they need to graduate. And then we have construct validity, which refers to the validation of a theory behind a measurement, and its primary focus is on what is being measured rather than the instrument itself. Pretty much meaning that needs the measurement needs explanation. Assessment construct validity is particularly important in situations where there is no well-defined or operational construct available, and yet the researchers are interested in measuring the construct or concept. Construct validation is a process of documenting supporting evidence from a variety of sources in order to demonstrate a network or relationship among the measures in question and other relevant concepts. Construct validation is more difficult than a single culture study due to the problem of transcultural. Cross-cultural studies have provided extensive data challenging the adequacy of the disease model. Researchers are now suggesting that the culture is simply incidental mental disorder and therapy. Um, Basic variables which interacts with biological and environment variables and determine the cause, manifestation, and treatment of the entire spectrum of mental disorder. All behaviors culturally related and all mental disorders and therapies are culture specific. Then we talked about personality tests. Personality tests are most widely used methods among psychologists. Personality test refers to the standardized instruments that are designed to measure personality traits of the individual. Traits are more or less enduring personality characteristics or stable dispositions that are relatively independent from situations fluctuation. And then these are the personality traits you're testing. The first one is stability of a person's dispositions, prevalence of a major common trait in all individual, comparability of the individual traits in terms of their strength, and then you sum the total of measures as one of the personalities, and then the conditions under the penalty test are administered are identical for all respondents, so it's standardized. Personality will be characterized by the sum of the total traits. And then we have two major categories, which are objective, which is direct, and projective, which is indirect. So these are the two tests that are performed among the personality tests. The first one is the objective direct test. It was defined as they refer to paper and pencil personality inventories that are designed to elicit highly standardized responses from the subject. Usually, the subject is asked to make a choice between two or more alternatives. And then we talked about how objective tests are also called direct test behaviors because many of them contain face value based items that usually don't require subjectivity or indirect interpretation. Pretty much that you're taking fast value from whatever the questions you're administering. Objective test is cost effective and efficient for statistical analysis, but is not vulnerable to superficial overgeneralization and response distortion than the projective test, meaning that um, because we are getting this limited amount of group, you could overgeneralize, meaning that you could create like a stereotype or like uh, a generalization for a certain group without really having to be for the whole group. It's just specifically for that person. It also suffers of faking it, which is an additional problem. It's an intentional response distortion by the subject who attempts to either make themselves look bad or make themselves look good. And then they have created devices in order to find these. They're called detecting devices, which were developed and incorporated in most self report personality inventories. The biggest one they talk about is the MMPI, the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory. It includes four validity scales and to detect faking and any related response distortions. Do we have the Canal Say scale? Then we have the Lie scale, which is measured subject attempt to make a good impression by faking it. Then we have the frequency scale that can detect the faking of bad and excessive patterns of endorsement of these items by the subject. It may be considered as an indication of the subject faking bad confusion. And then we have the correlation scale, the K scale, designed to correct the main clinical scale by improving their discriminating functions. The MMPI contains 14 clinical scales. We have the hypochondrias, the depression, hysteria, psychopathic deviate, masculinity, femininity, paranoia, psychoasthenia, schizophrenia, hypomania, social introversion, anxiety, repression, ego strength, and alcoholism. And then these were the criticisms against the MMPI. The first one is that it's primarily designed for screening clinical patients, is not and thus is not adequate. And then we have instruments for assessing normal personality. Many normal subjects are often diagnosed and clinically at risk according to the MMPI. The retest reliability for the MMPI is poor over the long period of time. The test is too long and many items are highly interrelating, producing a redundancy. So it just repeats itself a lot, even though it has many questions. Then we have validity and reliability of the MMPI, and it depends on the demographic, socioeconomic, and cultural characteristic of the subject, such as age, sex, education, and ethnicity. MMPI remains as the most extensively used objective test on personality around the world. Then we talk about the CPI, which is designed especially for assessing multidimensional aspects of normal personality, such as dominance, self control, sociability, responsibility, socialization tolerance, achievement, intellectual efficiency. And then we also talk about the EEPS, which is designed to measure personality variable of a normal person and has a unique feature of a forced format. Then we have projective or indirect tests. And then in these, we talked about the interest method of assessing personality by presenting their subject with an ambiguous stimuli of material so that the subject response can be absorbed and analyzed. Projected tests are based on the assumption that the subject's personality dispositions are projected or reflected in the response to these material. And then we talk about what projection is. Projection was first used by Freud, and then it was referred to an ego defense mechanism, a process of attributing one's anxiety, producing impulses and thoughts to another person or external event. Projective tests needs to be understood in such a broad context, and they are supposed to reveal the respondent's subjective work with functions to construct meaning of objective reality. And then we talk about the projective test. The first one is an association technique. An association response to the stimulus words, ink blots, and sounds. An example of this is the Rorschach test. Then we have construction techniques. Construction or creation of stories about pictures. An example of this is the thematic perception test. Then we have the completion techniques of incomplete sentences or stories. An example of this is the sentence completion test. Then we talk about choice or order techniques, selection of appropriate items from a number of hypothetical alternatives, or arranging ambiguous items in terms of systemic or order or sequence. An example of this is the Sondhi test. And number 5 is the expressive technique, expression in drawing, and paintings or playing hypothetical roles. An example of this is the drawing a person test. So we're going to talk about the Rorschach test. This was invented by Hermann Rorschach, a Swiss psychiatrist. It consists of 10 cards that are displayed various shapes and colors of ink blot, but don't indicate any meaning themselves. So the cards themselves don't represent anything. We're more looking at them from what the subject is telling us. The cards and procedures of testing are standardized, and the second stage involves more detailed inquiries. The subject requests to examine each card in a sequence and account due to his or her perception. Pretty much, we get to understand their point of view and what they tell us by what they see. There are Navy systems for scoring interpreting research response. There's two introductory manual that have been widely used by beginning student Klopfer and Davison and Allen. Inkblots are but culture bound, pretty much you could use them in every culture and do not require literacy. There is a number of difficulties using the Rorschach for non-Western subjects, and one point is language problems in administrating the test and interaction problems between the test and the subject. These are the problems that come with the Rorschach. Non-Western subjects include the test environment, personality, interaction between testers and subject, and most importantly, the cross-culturally validity of the test. Validity and reliability of the Rorschach test have been questioned not only across cultures research, but also research conducted in Western societies. Projective techniques are designed in principle to measure subjective dimensions of a personality, which requires the researcher's interpretation a great deal more than the other highly standardized direct test or observation. Attempt to cover the subject's psychodynamic but interpretive process. Then we move on to the thematic perception test. Originated by C. D. Morgan and Henry A. Murray, the test consists of 30 black and white picture cards and one blank card depending on the age of the sex of the subject. The tester selects a particular set of cards, usually 20 or less, and the subject is suppressed to make up a story and should include what leads to that being depicted. The tat simply puts a test indication which is assumed to be a projection or representation of the subject's personality. The attribute of the hero or main character in the story represents the tendencies in the respondent's own personality. That characteristic of the hero's environment represents significant aspects of the respondent's own environment. So you're expecting that whatever the subject is telling you, it's mirroring what they're living. However, disadvantage of that is that it's less standardized and not as subjective. These are the criticisms against the TAT, which are very little standing, low reliability, too heavy in reliance or intuitive hunches, and interpreting the meaning of the response. Difficulty of determining congruence between the subject and expressed fantasies, so you don't know what's real and what's not, and what's their desire. And then the question of cross-cultural validity. The TAT has been extensively used in cross-cultural researchers, and its cross-cultural validity has not been firmly established because of the equivalence problems of language and picture content. Various efforts have been made to modify the original Murray pictures for particularly racial and cultural groups. TAT may provide the subjects with a different set of stimuli that are not intended in the original test. Modified TAT, however, have a number of different tests providing different series of stimuli. TAT are also vulnerable to faking. However, people would tend to use this because its content is less culture bind and more sensitive to depth or conscious factor. So then we move on to content analysis of history materials. Life history materials include oral history, non-literature people collected by anthropologists, case histories of mental patient analysis by psychiatrists, biographies, autobiographies of famous people, and letters and diaries and other personal documents. This is referred as to the systematic method of analyzing the symbolic content of oral and written communication. The method consists of selection of the definition of content categories relevant to the research objective, sampling of materials that represent the content categories chosen, and then quantification or determination of salient categories. Analysis of quantified or salient study categories and relationships. And then it could be criticized for its lack of objective criteria by which the validity of the content and interpretation could be examined. The advantage of this is that life history study derives from the accuracy, but more for the subject experience. So you're not really trying to understand um, what's happening, but instead you want to see the ways the subject is experiencing what's happening around them. And then we have analysis of folklore materials. This is usually transmitted from one person to another, and it comes in forms of myth, folk tales, legends, jokes, epics, speech proverbs. And then it's produced in a social culture context and are intended to collect psychological of the prime who created it. And I did social personality because they're trying to understand the subject's um, culture, and you're not trying to understand the subject itself, but more like the people around them and how they work. The function of folklore are by aiding the education of the young, promoting groups or feelings of solidarity, providing social sanctioned ways for an individual to act superior or censor them, serving as a vehicle for social protest, offering an enjoyable escape from reality, and converting dual work into play. And then analysis of folklore is usually divided into three major approaches, which is a psychoanalytical interpretation of symbolism in folklore and acid culture. Then we have correlation studies between various themes in folklore and actual behavior pattern. Intensive case studies of the folklore of a participant society. And then we have Fromm's psychoanalysis of the Little Red Riding Hood. And then this is the story of the Little Red Riding Hood, and we depict the things and the meanings. So the little red cap, it's a symbol for menstruation. Then we have the dangers of losing their virginity and confronted with sex. The wolf trying to eat pretty much the girl. The wolf's sexual appetite is aroused by the sight of the girl when he tries to seduce pretty man. The wolf represents the man, and the girl just represents a young girl. And then the male is portrayed as the ruthless and cunning, and the sexual act is described as the cannibalistic. Um, it is antagonistic against man and sex, and then speaks of the this is supposed to be male, but speaks of male-female conflict. Then we talk about right study on child training practice and folktale aggression. They analyzed 12 folktales for 33 societies out of 75 societies. The main study was in correlation between the degree of severity and aggression training and the degree of intensity and aggressive acts as expressed in the folktale. These were Wright's finding. The analysis of the folktale data supports the central feature that the theory, which was developed to supply insight into the consequences of the outcomes of actions and behavior in folktales. The approach avoidance theories of Miller reinstates the term of Whiting's modification of its influences and conflict produce. Uh, we have, in general, it is found that high punishment anxiety, when it's connected with the expression of aggression, leads to the kind of folktale behavior in which the object and agent of aggression are far from generalization and are least likely a hero. Let's move on to Benedict's study of the subject mythology. The popularity of the theme abandoned children in Sunni. We have psychological significance that parallels the familiar daydream of the children in our civilization, with details their parents suffering at their death. Expression resentment directed by the children against their parents and worked out into a daydream of the child image vantage. Researchers attempted to articulate the relationship between folklore and personality mostly by intuitive analysis, but sometimes empirical research. Folklore personality analysis. The folklore may reflect culture and personality patterns of an earlier stage in society, history, and those of the present. Folktale diffuses widely from one society to another, but some folktales don't necessarily reject the ethos of a particular society. The presence of a particular folklore motive, we cannot tell whether the motive directly expresses a characteristic pattern in the society or whether they are wishful fantasy. They are used by scholars in order to explain the reality of events. Example given was one of the floods, in which it takes about two contrasting floods, and there must be a little bit of truth in each legend, because the legend has survived for so long. You expect it to be real, some of it to be a little bit real. Some of the problems include the interpretation, and then an analysis of folklore does not provide an important alternative source of information for studying the source of information. Personality, especially the conscious or implicit dimensions of the collective consciousness of society. We talk about the analysis of Western and Chinese art. In Western art, it focuses around men and women as an individual, and in Chinese, the individual should be part of the society instead of themselves. We talk